Picture this. You're in school, it's been a long day, and really, you just want to go home. But then, the teacher wheels in a TV set. And it's this feeling of being rewarded for not being a nuisance to our teachers for 10 minutes. It's just that when we actually get around to watching the movie, the teacher pauses it every 2 seconds to make us analyze some arbitrary semi-detail we just saw. And you might think of it as incredibly annoying, and don't get me wrong, it absolutely is. But there is a lot more to movies than just entertainment, which is probably why they show them in class anyway. Which brings me to the movie to discuss today, Billy Elliot. It's a movie about an English working-class boy living in the 1980s. His brother and father are occupied with a miners' strike, while Billy discovers something about himself that no less but shocks his father. Something so unbearable, his father is thrown deeper into his personal crisis. Billy likes to dance. And not just any dance, but
friggin' Bali.
By finding his passion, Billy doesn't only challenge society's expectations about gender, but also his father's sense of his own masculinity. Additionally, there's the question of queerness that is present throughout the movie. Before discussing it any further, let's define a few terms. What's gender, for example? Gender is a social construct that has been in constant reformation throughout history. It is not limited to binary of female or male, but rather seen as a spectrum. And gender is influenced by biological, social, and cultural factors. Masculinity, on the other hand, is to be understood as a set of attributes commonly associated with men, partially based on biological factors. Attributes associated with masculinity are strength, lack of emotion, violence, leadership, and success. Toxic masculinity is the complete submission to society's standards without respecting one's own inherent identities and needs, which ultimately strives to keep up a male-dominant society. Lastly, the idea of queerness in this case is to be understood as differing from heteronormativity. Being queer means being different, including non-heterosexual and non-cisgender identities. In the case of Billy Elliot, the dancing and dancing classes are queer spaces in which the question of sexuality is prevalent, as seen by the constant mentions of being or not being gay as a dancer. Billy discovers he is a dancer when he accidentally gets stuck in Mrs. Wilkinson's ballet class. But it is way before that scene that Billy is introduced as someone drawn in by rhythm and movement. Dancing comes to him as a natural state of his being. That's why understanding himself as a dancer does not disturb his masculinity. He's a boy and he likes to dance, and to him there's nothing more to it, and it doesn't make him less of a male. It is only the possibility of queerness that ever bothers him, but not because it threatens his masculinity, but because it marks him as different in a community that has clear understandings of gender roles. Billy is faced with the expectations of a community that is stuck in his ways, as seen by Billy's father handing down the boxing gloves both himself and his own father had worn and used. That's why dancing ballet doesn't only entail having to part with family tradition and possibly having to face the disappointment of his father, but also going against what his surroundings would identify as masculine. He is finally at peace when his passion for dancing is embraced. Contrary to the rest of the community, he is also faced with his cross-dressing, later out and proud gay best friend Michael, who possibly opens his eyes to the fluidity of gender expectations and identity. There's even a rather intimate moment between the two boys when, as he tells him goodbye, Billy kisses his cheek, mirroring the gesture of affection Michael offered him months before. In the end, Billy is sitting comfortably in a place of queerness, not quite defined one way or another, dancing in an all-male production of Swan Lake by Matthew Bourne. His father, Jackie Elliot, meanwhile faces a battle with his masculinity. With his wife dead, he's missing a female counterpart to support him. He was reliant on the presence of femininity to counter and empower his masculinity, so now this balance is taken away from him. At that point, his masculinity is already standing on shaky grounds. By the time of the ever-present miners' strike, he also has to face the possibility of failing as a provider, which deepens his struggles. Additionally, his dominance as a patriarch of the family is threatened.
I hate you! You're a bastard!
His older son Tony gets increasingly frustrated with the strike. Jackie is ultimately powerless against. However, when he is finally directly confronted with Billy dancing proudly and passionately in front of him, he realizes that in order to be a good father and to deal with his own crisis around his masculinity, he has to embrace his son's identity. He first tries to reinstate his masculinity in position of power by breaking the strike and therefore reclaiming his position as the patriarchal provider of the family, but Tony stops him, realizing that his father giving up his principles won't make him feel any better about himself. Tony assures him that there are other ways to support Billy. So instead of reclaiming his position as a financial provider, his masculinity crisis is ultimately solved not by regressing into familiar standards and gender roles, but by being emotionally available to his family and therefore directly opposing restrictive expectations around gender and masculinity. He also sacrifices the relics of femininity he's been holding on to, his wife's jewelry he sells, to send Billy to the London audition. In the end, he's shown as a caring and supportive father who got over traditional expectations around gender, a man who's secure enough in his masculinity that he feels free to express his emotions and be vulnerable. Ultimately, Billy Elliot is not just about nostalgia or the miners' strike. It's not even just about a dancing boy from a working class community. It is about gender norms and showing dance not just as an expression, but as a tool to break out of the confines of toxic masculinity. There is, of course, way more to this movie and even more to this discourse. This video is merely scratching the surface, which clearly demonstrates the point that I was making in the beginning. A movie is much more than just entertainment. Maybe enduring the teacher's obsession with the pause button, while completely annoying, was worth it after all.